Hi, this is Andre, and thanks for checking out Synthosophy. Synthosophy is scientifically integrating the wisdoms of history, based on fact and truth, into our present culture. Let's take a look today at Chapter 22, Fantasyland. Recall, neuroreality is the perception of reality and our surroundings generated by the brain and its 100 billion neurons. This perception is not the actual reality. It is only the reality as perceived by the 100 billion neurons in your brain, firing away, generating that perception with the input from your five senses. That input gets processed by the 100 billion neurons in your brain, and that generates your consciousness, your neural reality. Fantasyland is a term used to describe one's perception of reality, one's neuroreality, when that perception is far from actual reality. The following will be quotes from the book Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, a 500-Year History, by Kurt Anderson, with occasional commentary by myself. The first part of the book I'll be referring to is All That Glitters, the Gold Seekers. During the 1500s, European fantasies of worldly splendors had just acquired a thrilling new inspiration and focus. In 1492, Columbus had sailed west in search of a shorter route by sea from Europe to Asia that might replace the overland Silk Route. An impossible dream then and for 400 years afterward. Instead of Japan, he found the Bahamas. But he had discovered a new world. It was a blank slate of which fantastic wealth and glory could be imagined from 3,000 miles away. The Spaniards who followed Columbus, instead of searching in vain for a northwest passage to Asia, headed southwest. There they discovered advanced civilizations with cities, the Aztec in Mexico and the Inca in South America. And there they found the Aztecs and Incas' gold, which they stole and mined for more than a century, thereby establishing a transatlantic empire. The English envied the suddenly powerful Spanish, and their New World gold in particular. If there was so much treasure for the taking in the southern reaches, why not thousands of miles closer in the north, in the lands closest to England? Thus, the quest for gold became a fetish for would-be English colonists as the 1500s turned into the 1600s. It also established a theme we'll encounter again and again. Around some plausible bit of reality, Americans leap to concoct wishful fictions they ardently believe to be true. A young Oxford graduate named Richard Hakluyt was among the most excited and influential of England's America enthusiasts during the 1580s and 1590s. He cherry-picked the reports of earlier explorers, many of them second-hand and third-hand, to depict a perfectly right paradise. All those probes into eastern North America, he wrote in a 40,000-word manuscript, prove infallibly unto us that gold, silver, precious stones, and turquoise and emeralds have been by them found. The southern part had in the land gold and silver. A bit to the north there was also sure to be gold, because the color of the land doth altogether argue it. And farther north too there is mention of silver and gold. At the time, England's population was growing faster than its economy, so Hakluyt proposed shipping those idle men to America and setting them to work in gold mines. Hakluyt's breathless chronicle of America had been commissioned by the 32-year-old aristocrat, poet, adventurer, zealous Protestant, and gold-mad New World enthusiast Walter Raleigh. He was a charming, larger-than-life up-and-comer, a stereotypical go-go American before the English America even existed. As soon as he had Hakluyt write his report on the New World, meant to convince Queen Elizabeth to colonize, Raleigh, over the course of just 3 years, became Sir Walter Raleigh. He got the royal franchise to exploit and govern the eastern coast of North America and sent 3 separate expeditions of Englishmen to get the gold. Guess what? They found none. To go into a bit more detail, a famous English poet published his Ode to the Virginian Voyage, calling Virginia Earth's only paradise, where Britons would get the pearl and the gold. And plenty of English people imagined that it was literally a new Eden. Alas, no. A large faction of the first settlers dispatched by Raleigh became sick and died. He dispatched a second expedition of gold hunters. It also failed, and all those colonists died. But Sir Walter Raleigh continued believing the dream of the gold. He failed to find the legendary golden city of El Dorado when he sailed to South America in 1595, but that didn't stop him from propagating the fantasy in England. He published a book about it that consisted of second-hand historical anecdotes meant to make the dream seem real. Raleigh helped invent the kind of elaborate pseudo-empiricism that in the centuries to come would become a permanent feature of Fantasyland testimonials, about religion, about quack science, about conspiracy, about whatever was being urgently sold at the moment. In 1606, the new English king, James, despite Raleigh's colonization disasters, gave a franchise to 2 new private enterprises, the Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth, to start colonies. The southern one, under the auspices of London, they named Jamestown after the monarch. Their royal charter was clear about the main mission: to dig, mine, and search for all manner of mines of gold, and to have and enjoy the gold. As Tocqueville wrote in his history 2 centuries later, it was gold seekers who were sent to Virginia. No noble thought or concept above gain presided over the foundation of the new settlements. 2/3 of those first 100 gold seekers promptly died, but the captain of the expedition returned to England claiming to have found gold-showing mountains. Keep in mind, no gold was found. Anxious investors in London demanded the colonists produce at least 1 chunk of real gold. In 1610, 3 years into the operation, they dispatched a new man to set things right, who arrived just as the surviving colonists finally abandoned the dream and were setting sail home for England. Lord de la Warr persuaded them to disembark, return, and buck up. He led a team inland to search for another rumored Indian gold mine, where de la Warr's men killed some Indians and finally found no gold. In 1614, yet another Plymouth Company expedition sailed to New England, this one exclusively in pursuit of gold. They had an inside man aboard, a native who'd been captured and enslaved by an earlier Plymouth Company ship off Cape Cod. This Indian had spent his entire captivity in London learning English and the nature of his captor's shiny metal fixation. So he concocted a story just for them. "There's a gold mine on my own island," he lied, "and I'll take you back there to claim it." When the English anchored off Martha's Vineyard, he jumped ship, and his tribal brothers covered his escape with bows and arrows fired from their canoes. Then the Englishmen realized they had been played and sailed home. Down in Virginia, meanwhile, more than 6,000 people had emigrated to Jamestown by 1620, which was the equivalent of a mid-sized English city at the time. But no, at least 3/4 of them had died, but the abiding dream had not. People kept coming and believing, hopefulness becoming delusion. It was a gold rush with no gold. The sickness and weakness and death continued. Gold remained a chimera. 2 decades into the 17th century, English America was a failing startup, a vaporware tragedy, and a farce. But back in England, the investors and their promotional agents continued printing posters, hyperbolic testimonials, and dozens of books and pamphlets, organizing lotteries, and fanning out hucksterish blue smoke. Thus, the first English-speaking Americans tended to be the more wide-eyed and desperately wishful. Most of the 120,000 indentured servants and adventurers who sailed to the South in the 17th century, according to the University of Pennsylvania historian Walter McDougall, did not know what lay ahead, but were taken in by the propaganda of the sponsors. The historian Daniel Burston went even further, suggesting that American civilization has been shaped by the fact that there was a kind of natural selection here for those people who were willing to believe in the advertising. Which brings to mind, question your perception. So Western civilization's first advertising campaign was created in order to inspire enough dreamers and suckers to create America. Is Fantasyland in our genes? As a get-rich-quick enterprise, Virginia was a bust. The colonists who stayed resorted to the familiar drudgery of agriculture, although the cash crop that saved them was a harbinger of a certain future America. It was indigenous, novel, glamorous, inessential, psychoactive, and addictive. Tobacco. This was the birth of the tobacco industry, introduced by the native Indians and capitalized upon by the settlers. Another leader in the colonization, he was an enthusiast. He was Francis Bacon. He was an English government official and philosopher who at the time was also laying the foundations for science and the Enlightenment. He was bracingly clear-eyed about the New World Project, and he seemed to understand better than any of his proto-American contemporaries the distorting power of wishful belief. How fantasy can trump fact. The human understanding, he wrote in 1620, when it has once adopted an opinion, draws all things else to support and agree with it. And although there be a greater number and weight of instances to be found on the other side, these it either neglects or despises, or else by some distinction sets aside and rejects, in order that by this great and pernicious predetermination, the authority of its former conclusions may remain inviolate. And such is the way of all superstition, he continued, whether in astrology, dreams, omens, divine judgments, or the like, or in men, having a delight in such vanities, mark the events where they are fulfilled, but where they fail, though this happens much oftener, they neglect and pass them by. Was Bacon referring then to what is now known as our genetic, hardwired cognitive and confirmation biases, leading to those neurorealities? And was Sir Walter Raleigh an argumentative theory pitching a paradise fantasy land of gold across the ocean to the king and the masses of England? Did truth matter? Now, we'll skip 400 years ahead. Note that Anderson goes into great detail over those last 400 years. As he states in the title of his book, Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, a 500-year history. We will jump now to his comments on the recent past and the present. So let's continue with quotes from Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire. And the Internet. In the 1980s, before the web, Usenet was a kind of cross between email and social media. In 1994, the first spam was sent, visible to everyone on Usenet. Global alert for all. Jesus is coming soon. Over the next year or two, the masses learn of the World Wide Web. An exponential rise in Fantasyland and all its dominions now had its perfect infrastructure. It's hard to overstate the flabbergasting speed and magnitude of the change. In the early 1990s, when the internet was still an obscure geek thing, fewer than 2% of Americans used it. By 2002, less than a decade later, most Americans were online. After the 1960s and 70s happened as they happened, it may be that America's long-standing dynamic balance between thinking and magical thinking, reason and wishfulness, reality and fiction, sanity and lunacy, was broken for good. But once the internet came along, we were definitely on a superhighway to a certain destination with no likely-looking exits. Yes, we all know all about the extraordinary virtues and benefits of digital communication. You and I now have astounding access to information and ideas and cultural artifacts and people. In every pocket there is now a library, a phonograph, a radio, a movie theater, and a television, as well as a post office, a printing press, a telegraph, a still and video camera, recording studio, a navigation system, and a radio and TV station. It is advanced technology indistinguishable from magic. I'm not sure there ever would be any effective or acceptable way to permit all the internet's good parts and minimize the bad ones. By government fiat, by some spontaneous mass reactivation of our recessive American gene for restraint and moderation, or a populist democracy of individuals. So too much democracy and individualism were always going to be the direction in which we finally erred. In any case, the way internet searching was designed to operate in the 1990s, that is, the way information and belief now flow, how it rises and falls, is democratic in the extreme. On the internet, the prominence granted to any factual assertion or belief or theory depends entirely on the preferences of billions of individual searchers. Each click on a link, 1 trillion a year, is effectively a vote pushing that version of the truth toward the top of the pile of search results, because every link to a page increases that page's prominence. The main argument of this book concerns how so many parts of American life have morphed into forms of entertainment. From 1980 to the end of the century, that tendency reached a tipping point in politics and political discourse. First, a Hollywood celebrity became a beloved president by epitomizing and encouraging the blur between fiction and reality. Then talk radio and TV news turned into forms of politicized show business. And finally, the internet came along, making false beliefs both more real-seeming and more contagious, creating a kind of fantasy cascade in which millions of bedazzled Americans surfed and swam. Why did Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan begin remarking frequently during the 1980s and 90s that people were entitled to their own opinions but not to their own facts? Because until then, it hadn't seemed like a serious problem in America. With the internet, our marketplace of ideas became exponentially bigger and freer than ever. It's true. Thomas Jefferson said he'd rather be exposed to the inconveniences attending too much liberty than those attending too small a degree of it. And it would be all okay because in the new United States, reason is left free to combat every sort of error of opinion. However, the author here is inclined to think if he had our other democratic forefathers returned, they would see the present state of affairs as too much of a good thing. Reason remains free to combat unreason, but the internet entitles and equips proponents of unreason and error to a previously unimaginable degree, particularly for a people with our history and propensities. The downside, this proliferation and reinforcement of nutty ideas and false beliefs, this assembling of communities of the utterly deluded, this construction of parallel universes that look and feel perfectly real, the viral appeal of the untrue, seems at least as profound as the upside. So with this in mind, the question to ask now is, how's your neuroreality? We'll scroll down and check out some quotes in the book. The Problem with Fantasyland, from 1980s to the present and beyond. Here are some quotes. One from Karl Rove, senior advisor to President George W. Bush back in 2004. You and what we call the reality-based community believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the real world really works anymore. We create our own reality. And here's one from Kellyanne Conway, counselor to President Donald Trump, January 2017, after the presidential inauguration. You're saying it's a falsehood. And our press secretary gave alternative facts. America was the dream world creation of fanaticists, some religious and some out to get rich quick, all with a freakish appetite for the amazing. Beyond our passionate beliefs in various kinds of magic and destiny, our particularly religious DNA, supercharged, was the source of other defining American habits of mind as well, such as the craving for the mysterious to be literal. Right now it appears fantasy may be beating the truth. Is it in our DNA? The author has referred repeatedly to full Fantasyland and to events and phenomena, such as President Trump, that wouldn't have happened before it emerged. Until now, I've avoided setting a precise date. When did it begin? Obviously after the 1960s and 70s and after Ronald Reagan. The 1990s were the Hinge decade. Oprah and Limbaugh and the X-Files swept the nation. The NRA called law enforcement officers jackbooted thugs. A wrestler from the booming Worldwide Wrestling Federation was elected governor of Minnesota. Disney built his perfect make-believe town in Florida, and the federal building in Oklahoma City was blown up. The Pats Robertson and Buchanan ran for president. President Clinton was investigated for murdering his White House counsel before being investigated for lying about adultery. Final Fantasy was launched, and so were the National Institutes of Health's Alternative Medicine Center and Reality TV and Fox News. And of course, the internet. Starting in 1995, everyone could browse the web. So let's call 2000 the first year of a majority of Americans were online. The unequivocal first year of full Fantasyland. But then I look at the rise and fall of ancient Greece. The 7 centuries of Greek civilization are divided into 3 areas: the archaic, the classical, and the Hellenistic. During the first, the one depicted by Homer, Greeks' understanding of existence defaulted to supernaturalism and the irrational. Then, suddenly, science and literature and all the superstar geniuses emerged: Sophocles, Euripides, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. In the period we canonize as ancient Greece. But that astonishing era lasted less than 2 centuries, after which Athens returned to astrology and magical cures and alchemy. Why? According to The Greeks and the Irrational by the Oxford classicist Eric Dodd, It was because they finally found freedom too scary, frightened by the new idea that their lives and fates weren't predestined or managed by gods, and they really were on their own. Maybe America's classical period has also lasted 2 centuries, 1800 to 2000, give or take a few decades on each end. In any case, our circumstance doesn't seem altogether new. Fantasyland has been the norm for the run of humanity. The unusually rational and scientific centuries here and there along the way, like the last few, are exceptions. Dominant cultures have had their enlightenments and golden ages before, and then return to primitivism and murk. So the question to ask, where will we go as a nation?